Good morning, brothers and sisters at St. Mark's. We begin a 3-week interesting Bible study of things that are totally unconnected, but surprising, and in this first one, sometimes a little naughty, but they're all in the Bible. Today, I would like to talk about primarily the Gospel of Matthew as we look at it from the eyes of a first century Jew. Now, Matthew's Gospel is the most Jewish of the Gospels, so that can be helpful. And sometimes we find out things that are in totally unexpected places, so these are unexpected stories. Today I will deal with the genealogy of Jesus, which is the first part of Matthew, the part with all the so-and-so begot so-and-so begot so-and-so that everyone skips, but there's a hidden message in it. Then we'll deal with the Christmas stories, also called the infancy narratives, and then if there's time we'll go on to the baptism of Jesus. Now, you got to remember that Gospels are not biographies or historical treatises in the modern sense. Gospels were written to make an evangelical point. Jesus is God in the flesh, he died and rose again, and he is the Messiah. Come follow him. We have to be aware of the Jewish background to better understand the Gospels. So we look at Matthew's genealogy. Two things right off the bat. There are women in Matthew's genealogy. This is very rare. Our forefathers in the Hebrew faith were patriarchal, and yet we have 5 women mentioned. And then he says twice that we have 14 generations between David and Jesus. He makes this point about 14. Okay, there's a reason for this. In the ancient world, there was a code system based on numbers and letters. So A would be number 1, B would be number 2, C would be number 3, and you get up to 9, and then you start the rest of the letters are the tens, and then the hundreds. So you can get a pretty large number. 14 is what he says twice. 14. He even leaves out a couple of kings to make it work out to be 14. Why? Okay, in the Hebrew alphabet, you have to count up 4, and you'll get Aleph, Beth, Gimel, Daleth, D. And then you count up to 6, and you'll get V, and then you've got a 4 again, which is the D. So you've got in Hebrew, DVD. Hebrew was written without vowels. This is David. This is David, okay? He's making his point. This is the heir of David. This is called gematria. And it works in Hebrew and in Greek. Remember it, because it will show up again in the book of Revelation. So, these women mentioned in his genealogy are Tamar, Rahab, Ruth, Bathsheba, and Mary, the mother of Jesus. And I'm going to tell you their stories, and this is the part where you're supposed to say if there are young children in the room that you don't want to explain these things to, send them away now, because it is spoken of frankly in the Bible. Tamar. Tamar was married to who was the son of Judah, and Judah was the son of Jacob, as in Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Important family, patriarchal tribe. So, but turned out to be unrighteous, so God killed him. Now, levirate marriage indicated back in those days that so his seed does not die out, the next brother has to marry her. The next brother was Onan. Onan already had a wife and kids, and the heirs were all set up. He really did not want to father another heir he'd have to take care of, and so he practiced an ancient form of birth control called coitus interruptus and spilled his seed upon the ground. So God was not happy. God killed him. 2 things here. That's exactly what it says. God killed him. Well, now this is hard to take, isn't it, for us? We have Jesus, God in the flesh, who was not that kind of person at all. What happened? Did God mellow in his old age? Or, well, come on. We have to understand that we often use our own cultural values to describe God, and so did the ancient Jews. And God, they thought, would want them to wipe these people off the face of the earth. So that's why it says that. God, I think, does not just to say, oh, I see you're not being good, I'll kill you. No, we know better than that. The other thing is coitus interruptus. If you want to know more about that, Google it. Everyone knows that I'm not a Puritan in this parish, but to describe exactly what that entails is going for me just a step too far on the parish's YouTube channel. All right. So she's gone through 2 of Judah's sons. Judas promises her the 3rd son when he gets old enough, and then he puts her off and puts her off and puts her off. And so, clever woman that she is, she comes up with a plan to get to stay within the family and bear a child. She veils herself. She dresses as a prostitute, and she knows she can stand by the city gate that Judah's going to come out of, and that's where apparently the prostitutes plied their trade, and he would come by. And sure enough, Judah comes by, avails himself of her services, and they had agreed on a price of 1 goat. I won't even get into that. 1 goat, but of course he didn't have a goat on him, so she requires a pledge. So Judah gives Tamar his staff, his cord, and the seal. This absolutely identifies him, you see. So the next day, Judah, honorable as it were that he was, sends the goat with some staff, with a servant back to the gate. They couldn't find that woman. The prostitute had indeed disappeared. So now Tamar then finds herself pregnant by Judah, something she had hoped for and planned for. When her pregnancy became obvious, she is denounced as an adulteress and sentenced to death. Before this can happen, Tamar sends to Judah the staff, the cord, and the seal with a note saying, "These are the possessions of the man who made me pregnant." Aha! Gotcha. So, Judah lets her off the hook, never has sex with her again, and Tamar gives birth to twins. The oldest is Perez, and he is an ancestor to King David. So here's an important ancestors of King David who got there by a really iffy kind of plan. The next person is Rahab. Rahab is generally referred to as Rahab the harlot. Harlot, simply an old word that means prostitute. Now, the story of Rahab is in the book of Joshua. And God is leading the Israelites into the promised land, and Jericho has to be, the capital city there has to be destroyed. And Joshua is the successor to Moses. Notice, please, and I will say this many times, Joshua, which in Hebrew is Yeshua, is the same name that Jesus has, Yeshua. Okay. So, God parts the river Jordan, like he parted the Red Sea for Moses, so the people can cross over and make camp before the battle. Now, before this parting of the Jordan, Joshua has sent spies into Jericho to scout it out. There, the 2 spies meet a prostitute named Rahab. She shelters the spies and acknowledges the God of Israel. When the soldiers come after the spies, she hides them and lets them down the wall of the city with a rope. So here come the gendarmes of Jericho finding out about these 2 spies. She lets them down. But before she lets them down, she exacts a promise from the spies that they will spare her and her family. The spies agree and tell her to get all of her family together and under no circumstances go outside, because when they attacked the city, it was under what was called cherem, which meant everything was to be destroyed. Men, women, and children murdered, the city leveled to the ground in ashes. So she's got to keep them all there. When the Israelites attack, she is to hang a red cord out of her window, and the Israelites will spare her. There are those that have postulated that this is where the red light thing comes from, but we don't know that. So, you remember how the Israelites conquered Jericho by taking the Ark of the Covenant and walking around the city, blowing horns. And on the last day, they did all that, and they shouted with a loud voice, and the walls come a-tumbling down. Okay, we know that story. So, they went ahead and destroyed everything, and Jericho was utterly destroyed, and Rahab and her family are spared, and Rahab becomes the ancestor of King David through her son Boaz. Okay, 2 sexually iffy situations with the women here, 2 important ancestors of King David. So, now we got the story of Ruth. Lovely story. It's placed back in the time before David. It may have been written later because of trouble after the Jews returned from Babylon and the priests made them send away their families and wives and children if they were Babylonians. And so this was to make a point about Ruth, a Moabite, a pagan, being an ancestor. So it starts this way. Naomi and her husband went to Moab because there was no work, there was a recession or something in Israel. There her husband dies and her 2 sons dies, and so she decides to go back to Israel. She tells her daughters-in-law to return to their own people. One goes away, but Ruth wants to stay with her mother-in-law, and she says that lovely biblical verse that we've all heard, "Entreat me not to leave thee, nor to depart from thee, for thy people shall be my people, and thy God my God." So Ruth goes with Naomi. They arrive poor in Judah and must find a way to eat. So Naomi sends Ruth to clean in the fields, that means pick up loose grain, where the owner is a relation of her late husband. Now, the man's name is Boaz. Boaz notices Ruth and tells servants to leave plenty of grain, even whole stalks for her. So Ruth gets a lot of grain. Naomi, finding out it's Boaz and he's a kinsman, Naomi tells Ruth to watch where Boaz sleeps and go to him in the night and uncover his feet, proclaiming he is the next of kin. Now, feet in the Bible is often a euphemism for a man's regenerative organs. So it can also be a woman's called feet. And we see that several times. So, in effect, Ruth seduces Boaz on the advice of her mother-in-law. But Boaz tells them there is a closer relative, and he calls out the other man in the presence of the elders, asking if the other man wants to buy the land that Naomi's late husband had. The other man does, but then Boaz reminds the other that if he gets the land, he gets Ruth as well. Well, the man had other heirs, and so he gives up the claim to the land, and Ruth and Boaz live happily ever after, and Ruth is one of the ancestors of David. Well, we got 3 kind of sexually iffy situations with the women. And the third one, you have undoubtedly heard this story, which is David and Bathsheba. David sees Bathsheba one night by looking down on Bathsheba's garden where she is nude and taking a ritual bath. That's supposed to be 10 days after menstruation. When you take that bath, when a woman is fertile, David lusts after her. He asks who she is, and he sends for her. They have sex. Some weeks after, Bathsheba sends David a note saying, "I am pregnant." David now has to cover his tracks. Bathsheba is the wife of Uriah. Uriah is one of David's palace guards. He's a big time in the army. So David tries to get Uriah to go home and relax and to wash your feet. There's the feet thing again. Wash your feet is a euphemism. Make love to your wife. Because that'll get David off the hook, you see. No. Uriah's sense of duty will not let him do this. He even sleeps on the floor of the palace to stay there. David tries again, but Uriah will not go home. So David plots with his general Joab to send Uriah into the midst of battle where he will surely be killed. Uriah was killed. Joab sends the message. David doesn't get angry about the loss of the raid, but now he can have Bathsheba. So David gets away with it, or so he thinks. Nathan the prophet shows up one day to talk to David, to say, "Oh, David, a great bad thing has happened in Israel. There are 2 men, one man with a whole flock of sheep, many, many sheep, and one with just a poor little ewe lamb." That's a female lamb. That's all he had. And the rich man was going to have some friends in for dinner, but he didn't want to kill his own sheep, so he killed the one little ewe lamb that this man had. What should be done with the man? And David was wroth with injustice, saying he should be put to death. And Nathan points his finger at David and says, "David, that man was you." So he caught him out with what he did with Bathsheba. So David repents and says, "I have sinned." Nathan says God would receive his repentance, but nevertheless the child would die. Now this is another kind of bad situation where, God seems to be complicit in, you two guys sin, but I'll take the child. No, that was just another one of these ideas that when justice is done, it can be done on someone through 5 and 6 generations, but it shows up. So we've now got Tamar, Rahab, Ruth, and Bathsheba. Shady ladies, but important in the history of Israel and our ancestors of King David. And the last one we have is Mary, the mother of Jesus. Now, what? All these others, and we've got Mary included in the shady lady list? Well, that's telling us something. It means there was gossip, there was talk, there was whispered innuendos, all kinds of stuff about Mary and her being pregnant and she and Joseph not being married. So, he's telling us that here. Okay? Don't worry about this. Remember these other 4 that were great leaders in Israel? Well, same thing with Mary. Now, there were early scandalous stories. The one that's most famous was by a pagan guy who did not like Christians named Celsus, who said Mary had been made pregnant by a Roman soldier called Pantera, and that the whole world knew about it. Okay, that did show up. Now, the earliest date I can find written for that is 148 AD. That's a little late to be on to get the real scoop there. So I don't believe it. It was also countered by 50 years later by a church father called Origen that just destroyed it. That kind of stuff happened. But there was the talk. Well, if I think about this, Matthew says, like Luke says, that Mary was a virgin when she conceived. What are you going to do? Mary, who's the father of that child? And Mary would say, well, this angel showed up and said that it was God, the Holy Spirit, and it's a miracle. Now, yeah, sure. Tell me another one, So they're kind of caught there. I think that's what happened, but I think there was talk. So that's the thing about the hidden message in the genealogy. Then there's the stories of Jesus' birth, the Christmas stories. So, first of all, when was Jesus born? Probably from 7 to 4 BC. Why not 1 AD? Because some monk who was trying to date from the Roman emperors forgot it too and sent the whole thing off, 3 to 7 years. His name was Dionysius, but there it was. Where was he born? Well, he has to be born in Bethlehem because that was Micah's prophecy. And what was his name? His name was Yeshua, which means Joshua. But Yeshua in Greek is Jesus, written in Greek letters. And when you take Jesus in Greek letters and put them in Latin letters, it looks like Jesus, pronounced Jesus in Latin. But as Latin changed into other languages, you get Jesus in Spanish, Jesus in French, and Jesus in English, okay? That's how we get it. So keep that in mind because Joshua is important. Now, what does the typical Christian tell you about the Christmas stories? Well, Joseph and Mary left Nazareth and they went down to Bethlehem, and we've seen the picture. Mary is sitting on the donkey's side saddle, very pregnant. Joseph is leading the donkey. They get to Bethlehem. They go to an inn. They find there's no room there. They talk to the innkeeper, and the innkeeper tells them, well, they could probably be put up in the stable, which is this barn behind the house. No, that's probably not what happened. In the first place, there's no donkey mentioned there. There's no innkeeper mentioned in the Bible. And there were a few places that had an outside building for animals. So we have to know about this from a Jewish point of view. Okay, in the first place, in those days, most people traveled in a group for safety. They'd go in little caravans, okay? And would Joseph and Mary have traveled so near to Mary's delivery date, within a week or something of that to go? That doesn't seem very logical. And indeed, Luke's gospel says when they had been there for a while, the time came for her to be delivered. Also, if they were from Bethlehem, wouldn't have they had some family to put them up? So, was it an inn or was it some relative's guest room? Okay, it could have been even a guest room for hire, like an Airbnb, okay? And the word they use for guest chamber is kataluma. Now, kataluma is also a word that was used for Jesus' Last Supper, the upper room. That was a kataluma. When Luke tells the story of the Good Samaritan putting up the wounded man in an inn, it's a totally different word, pandokion. So kataluma is a guest room. It could either be one of their relatives, or it could be that someone had already filled it. So I kind of think it was probably a relative. And when the time came to be delivered, they had to give Mary some privacy, and birth could be a bit messy, someplace that they could deal with that. And so they put her in a stable. But in those days, the stables were the first floor of the house. In some places in Switzerland, they still do this. The ground floor is where they put the animals, okay? So the animals on the ground floor, you go up to the living quarters in the kataluma, and then sometimes if it's hot, you sleep on the roof, okay? That's what a house looked like. And sometimes these houses were built over caves, which are numerous around Bethlehem, or even just splits in the rock, a crevice, some kind of thing. So that's the case, I think, of where Jesus was born. It was where the animals were, and it was a cave. There's a long tradition of this cave thing. If you ever go to the Church of the Holy Nativity in Bethlehem, you have to go under the church. It's in a cave, and you have to look down to where the manger was, okay? So, there's that situation. Now, in Matthew's Gospel, there's no angels, there's no shepherds, and when they're in a house later on, the Magi come. Now, who were the Magi, and was there a star? Now, Magi only appear in Matthew. A magos could be an astrologer, a scientist, or a sorcerer. We actually have a cognate word, which is mage, but mages are not around anymore. They're like wizards and warlocks and stuff, okay? Wise men is probably a good translation. We do not know when they came, only that they found Mary in a house. Where was Joseph? He wasn't there for them. There were 3 gifts, gold, frankincense, and myrrh. That doesn't mean, however, there were only 3 wise men. I mean, there could have been 4 or 5 wise men. They had 3 gifts they gave together, okay? They may have been Persian court officials making diplomatic courtesy calls to a new king. And the star? Well, the Essenes, another Jewish sect at the time of Jesus, thought the star was the Messiah himself. And the Dead Sea Scrolls attest to that. Then there were several celestial events. Around 3 or 4 BC, Chinese astronomers recorded a comet that was viewable for 70 days. There was also a conjunction of Jupiter and Venus around this time. When the wise men spoke to Herod, and we know when Herod died, he died in 4 BC, Herod seems unaware of a star. Well, that could mean it just wasn't that dramatic, and I can attest to that personally, as some of you can. On the 21st of December of 2019, there was a conjunction of Saturn and Jupiter, and it was played up in the press, and so I wanted to see it. And I went out with my binoculars. Some of the neighbors thought I was probably spying on them, perched up there. And it was really good to see. You could see Saturn reaching behind Jupiter, and it was brighter. But had I not known that it was a conjunction, I wouldn't have paid a whole lot of attention to it. I mean, it wasn't like an exploding nova or something. It was just a brighter star. So, then after the Magi story, remember they snuck away another way so they wouldn't have to tell everything to Herod. Herod decides to kill all the baby boys under 2 years old, and the Holy Family escapes into Egypt. And that's because Hosea says, "Out of Egypt shall I call my son." I wonder about that story maybe being a literary device sometimes, because it's all making Herod parallel to the Pharaoh of Egypt. The Pharaoh wants to avoid an Israelite savior, and so he ends up drowning them all, but Moses gets saved, and he saves his people. Herod wants to avoid a new king of Israel growing up, but Jesus does anyway, gets away and saves the world. So, when Herod dies, Joseph has another dream telling him to come home. So, Matthew then goes right on to John the Baptist and Jesus' baptism. Now, here we have a situation that you really do have to be a first century Jew to get the immediate visual of it, but if we study it, we can figure out what happens here. And it used to bother me as a child and a young man, if Jesus was perfect and he had not sinned, why was he coming to John to be baptized for the repentance of his sins? if he was already pure, if he was already clean. What was the reason for Jesus coming to be baptized? In the first place, that was not the first baptism or immersion Jesus had had. There is a thing of ritual purity, a washing thing called a mikvah in Judaism. Plural mikvahot, I'll just say mikvahs. Anyone that came to visit the temple had to take a ritual bath first. He had to enter the mikvah. Now, I didn't know a whole lot about mikvahs, so I emailed a Jewish friend of mine and I said, what can you tell me about mikvahs? She, in turn, emailed a friend in Israel who is Orthodox and devout, and that lady emailed her daughter who lives in LA and also Orthodox and devout, and I learned a whole lot about mikvahs. Mikvahs are still used by Orthodox women for purification after menstruation. They're also used to make converts. Now, in Jesus' day, devout Jews had to be immersed in a mikvah before going to the temple. Jesus had been immersed many times before John the Baptist, so it wasn't for purification or repentance from sin, as Jesus was sinless. Why did he get baptized? For a first century Jew, this would have been kind of obvious. Jesus was establishing his messianic bona fides, his claim to authority by doing this. Yeshua is Joshua. And if Joshua then was a successor to Moses, God parted the Red Sea for Moses, God parted the Jordan River for Joshua, Jesus came to the Jordan and entered the water for the baptism of John, and God parted the heavens for Jesus, and a voice proclaimed, "This is my beloved Son." After the Red Sea crossing, God said that to Israel, "You are my son." So Jesus becomes Israel incarnate. And if I can have you think of an equilateral triangle placed upside down on its tip. Right at the tip is Jesus now, faithful Israel. And then at the bottom, there's a triangle the other way, a tip placing the tip, looking like an hourglass. And from Jesus, the new Israel, the perfect Israel, the Son of God, comes the new people of Israel, the new Israel, the Holy Catholic Church. That's how that works. So, at this point, God is proclaiming Jesus at his baptism by those signs. So, the phrase then, Jesus after that, of course, goes out, as we know from Lent, into the desert for 40 days and 40 nights to fast. The phrase 40 days and 40 nights appears only twice in the Old Testament when it is applied to Moses and Elijah. The Israelites complained to Moses they were sick of eating manna, and Moses says, "Man does not live by bread alone, but by every word that comes from the mouth of God." When Jesus is tempted by the evil one to turn stones into bread, Jesus says these very words. In fact, every time Jesus is tempted by the devil, Jesus quotes Deuteronomy back at him. So we have a real Exodus theme going on here, and Jesus as the new Moses. So Moses and Jesus is the new Moses. This is his authority. It's the Moses, the first 5 books of the Bible, the Torah, the books of Moses. It's just, if you're a first century Jew, you're saying, "Oh, I see this," But he doesn't end there, Matthew. So, Jesus is the successor to Moses at his baptism, but there is more. If a first century Jew had seen John the Baptist, he or she would have thought, "Oh yeah, it's the prophet Elijah." That is because of how he dressed in animal skins and the simple diet he ate, locusts and wild honey. Now, locusts are like big grasshoppers, and many people today eat them. They can be part of the Mexican diet, for instance, fried grasshoppers. I would not be afraid to eat grasshoppers if they were fried in sesame oil in a wok and then served with soy sauce. I've never done it, though. As I was studying up for this lecture, one source pointed out to me that locusts were kosher. So there's a piece of trivia you want to latch onto. The next time you're having your Jewish friends over for dinner or something, you can say, "Did you know that locusts are kosher?" That will be a wonderful thing. So, then, not only is Jesus the new Moses, Jesus is also the new John the Baptist and the new Elijah. And then Matthew takes us one last step. In the Old Testament, Elijah cast his cloak over his disciple Elisha. It's hard they sound alike. So I'm going to call Elisha, okay? So, and Elisha takes up where Elijah left off. So, John the Baptist, Elijah, gives precedence to Jesus, who is then also the chosen of Elisha. Wow. Now, if you're a first century Jew, you have seen this. So I think Matthew's gospel, most Jewish of gospels, does all these things on purpose. The Moses, Jesus, Elisha, Jesus, Elijah, Jesus, Joshua, Jesus, I think he did. Matthew is showing Jews that Jesus had the authority to be the new Moses and the new Elisha. But more than like them, Jesus he shows to be greater than Moses, Joshua, Elisha, or John the Baptist. Now here are a few parallels between Jesus and Elisha. Jesus' miracles were more elaborate than Elisha's. The Jordan River was parted for Elisha, but the heavens were parted for Jesus. Elisha caused an axe head to float on water. Jesus walked on water. Elisha healed a leper, but Jesus healed 10 lepers. Elisha fed 100 people with 20 loaves. Jesus fed 5,000 people with fewer. The Gospels attempted to link Moses and Elisha with Jesus to increase the impact of Jesus' story and to increase his authority. All of this would have been highly suggestible to an onlooking first century Jew. Okay, so that gets us through some things in Matthew's gospel, the genealogy, the Christmas stories, all the things about stars and wise men, on through that very interesting recount of Jesus' baptism. Jesus was baptized to set forth in the eyes of the people that God had chosen him Messiah. Next week, we look at the book of Revelation, something I have chosen because of things I saw on the internet. Could vaccines be the sign of the beast? Would a COVID passport be the sign of the beast? A lot of this stuff is coming out all the time, and it just isn't what that book was written for. So next week, I will give you a walkthrough from, which seems like DC Comics or Marvel's account of the end of the world, and we will see what the meaning really is. Thank you.